or anything. So therefore, how do they know that they're not indeed finished? Now, of course, that person bringing the papers would go back, but news traveled very slowly and so on. Travel for the group became somehow more difficult. Column after column of animals was spread over miles of country now in a long snaking shape, not even staying to any trail. Because there was often no prepared food for the exhausted riders at the end of the day, the problem started to be that the horse riders could go much faster than the wagons and the cook tents. Therefore, they would be at the end of the procession. At night, the riders would be way up there. They had to wait for those cook wagons to get up to them, and they said that they would not get to them until midnight or later. And so sometimes they had to get their sleep, and so therefore they had to go to sleep with nothing. The cook people, by the time they got there, they were so tired themselves that they were barely up in the morning to make any breakfast. It says, camped out in the open with a swamp with undrinkable water, no food, no supper. Supply wagons did not catch up until midnight many nights. 2 days later, there was no improvement. There was only one flapjack for each man for the next morning, even though we had nothing the night before. But they told us we were lucky to get it. Supper the same the next night. And the very next day, we were lucky to have anything at all. So, no water, then no food because of this problem. And how do you can't make those oxen go faster. The horses would go at a better speed, of course. On August 13th, French met with the Sioux with a full dress uniform. They had a peace pipe powwow and a mutual assurance and exchanges. The native people felt protected by the visible force and not eradicated. The first 10 years out west were spent working with the native people, not against them. So the Canadian native people were very aware of what was happening in the United States, that they were trying to eradicate them. And Sitting Bull did escape here after Custer's last stand, and he lived here for many years with his tribe, and were protected by the Canadians until he was forced back home again. But the Canadian Indians were very, very encouraged by the kindness and the generosity that they were shown by the Mounties. And they had a great respect for them, and even called Queen Victoria, bless her heart, she's over here, their mother. And so it was an association that would prove helpful. The natives felt protected. As Crowfoot, the Blackfoot Indian chief said, "The mounted police have protected us as the feathers of a bird protect us from the winter." The satisfied feelings were continually shared, and Crowfoot was willing to sign treaties after 4 years of the force entering the country. So it just shows the resentment, the hatred that the native people in the United States had for any soldiers or any authority was completely different in the Canadian setting, due partly to the Mounties. On August 25th, they traveled 528 miles and camped in the Cypress Hills. They gave rest for horses again to the last phase of the journey. One new event they encountered were the buffalo, and they had not seen any up until now. They were able to kill 5, and they were happy to get 953 pounds per buffalo for meat. Luckily, they got 5, but the only problem was, because the herds were so enormous still at this time, when they had chased them and when they had moved, they left all water holes totally undrinkable. Because as they walked and as they moved, they stirred up everything and did their business in the water, etc., etc. It was not drinkable. Having nothing else, the men filled their canteens anyway, boiled the water later, and added piles of tea to take the taste out. So that's all they could do. And I don't want to be it was more graphic in the material that I was reading. I'm trying to be kind here. And so the pastures around the buffalo hunt were also unusable. They were overgrazed and indeed trampled to death. The horses and cattle could get nothing then to eat, and it weakened them even further. So the horses and cattle the Mounties had were not in good shape anyway. And you're great to get the buffalo, but you get into this area that was not usable now for fodder at all. So to make matters worse, I want to get to the rest of the story. To make matters worse, on September 12th, they finally reached Alberta. They finally reached where they thought Fort Whoop-Up was. Their information was wrong. They were totally lost. In actuality, they were 75 miles west of the point, and they could have just gone around in circles for days, had they not another idea on French's part. He realized that the horses and animals and people were way too tired to go on, that they could not find Fort Whoop-Up now anyway, and so they went south, down to Fort Benton and the Sweetgrass Hills. And there the animals could get luscious food, and the humans could rest, and they could get food. They traveled 60 miles into the United States to Fort Benton, Montana, and they got a supply of oats, moccasins for their worn-out shoes, socks to put on because they were long gone, and other supplies that they needed. While at Fort Benton, they hired a guide named Jerry Potts. And he was very famous, and you could do lots of reading. I have a poster of him here, and there's been books written on him and so on. He was hired to help them find the needle in the haystack, Fort Whoop-Up. And so he returned with them to Canada, and he either knew where it was or had some way of finding. The group came back, and the trip that had lasted from July to September took them to their destination by October 9th. They had gone a total of 1,009 miles, and it had taken them 97 days. The fort, then they got to it, was a large stockade of had 14-foot walls, and had sharpened poles at the top. It wasn't a welcome mat. And there were cannons at every window and door, and the doors and windows and chimneys even were barred with iron. So everything was secured beyond belief. Always ready, the force used the field guns that they hauled across the whole country and were ready to fire and take on the people inside. When McLeod and Potts hammered at the door and were brave enough to do so, the main gate opened. A single man stood alone. It was an American, a Confederate Army veteran. The man had been sold the fort by the whiskey traders. Dave Akers was his name. He invited them in not to fight, but to a feast of vegetables. And Grandma said, eat your vegetables. Well, these people sure needed it here. McLeod wanted to buy the fort and use it for the force, but he refused, and he chose a site 28 miles along Old Man River and built Fort McLeod. It was built by December. The main objective was complete. Despite it all, not one policeman lost his life on the trail. French would say, "I am not sorry it's over," unaware that they had accomplished so much. The broad fact apparent that a Canadian force hastily raised, armed and equipped, and not under martial law, in a few months marched vast distances of the country that most had been unknown, and proved on bare pasture and scanty water that one could survive. Of such a march, the adverse circumstances, all true Canadians may feel proud. Inspector Jarvis added, "In conclusion, I may state that I look back over our journey. I wonder how we ever accomplished it with weak horses, little or no pasture, and for the last 500 miles, no grain for the animals, and the latter part of the roads either non-existent or impassable." By 1880, the CPR was being built. The rebellion of the Métis and the Cree people at the Battlefords and Prince Albert feared for their land. The rebels were defeated. The Mounties also did extensive work in the Yukon in the Gold Rush days. Their regular duties to protect the native people, and they'd done that for 10 years. They were the only civil servants in Western Canada. Every major town had a division of the RCMP. Each division had a superintendent, 2 inspectors with 100 sergeants, corporals, and constables. Indians and Métis scouts like Jerry Potts were often recruited, and again endeared the Indian people to them when they would take on their own and get them to show them the way. But the police knew that this was the only way. High percentage of time was spent on patrol. They went to farms and ranches and reserves. They patrolled every day and every night. They fought fires, found people lost in blizzards, carried mail, collected custom duties, were census takers, livestock inspectors, Indian agents, and public health officers. By 1920, the force was much bigger than they planned, and so Canada decided to call them not the Northwest Mounted Police, but the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because they were going to indeed serve Canada. So that is basically, roughly, the story of the RCMP and the party, pardon the phrase, that they had as they came to open this country for the rest of us. And because law came here before the settlers, we did not have as many difficulties like shootouts in the street like we see on all our great Western movies, where the families were in jeopardy and different things happened. It was just a different kind of settlement procedure here than had been enjoyed, or not enjoyed, pardon me, in the United States, with sheep farmers fighting cattle farmers and all kinds of battles going on. Now, I had a great deal of material to tell you what the Boundary Commission did to make this happen, to make you aware of this and get this all. So this sign, it just looks so simple, one little sign, what's the big deal? And nobody knew any of this material that I've told you, what the story of the RCMP was. And so a group called the Post Road Heritage Group out of Emerson, who wanted to see, they wanted to see that somehow the Northwest Mounted Police Trail would be marked and denoted, and people in the West would know about it. And so they talked to people and tried to get, and somehow they met up with a man, as you've mentioned already, Felix King. His picture is here on the bottom there, and he is holding an example of the sign. And when they wanted a sign, they had to decide what it was going to look like and what it was going to be and all this. So it was just like one nightmare after another. And it's great to have a dream, but when you keep going and thinking this is Disneyland, it's just not going to happen. And so Felix started out, he was the president of the group, and he originally was from Manitou. He was just a tremendous historian, and if I could be 1/10 like him and present ideas and do things like he did, it would be exciting. He worked first at creating a set of maps that showed exactly where the trail went, and he did that in 1988. I have those maps with me today. He also then worked in 1989 and found out where the camps were and marked those on the maps. And he showed people where, in present-day towns, how far away they were from the trail or from where the RCMP had gone. The Boundary Commission held monthly meetings, and the meeting that I was invited to was after the group had been going for about 1 year. They met every month, and each time they would share more information about the trail. And they would have a meeting at Thornhill, or Darlingford, or Killarney, or Deloraine, or Boissevain, or somewhere along the trail, and then people would come to the meetings from all of those locations. Each time they would spill out more information, and the idea came up that there was a story about the RCMP for every mile that the trail covered. Their next thing was to have the signs, as I mentioned, and this was accomplished after 4 years of wrangling, now pardon the phrase, with the government, and they had to write a law to allow you to do that, because never had a public group asked to put up a highway sign. You can put up a sign saying garage sale, but you couldn't put up a sign that was permanently along the highway at any time for any reason. And so they had to monkey around and get a law that would allow, and what the provisions would be, for you putting up a sign across the country. So that took 4 years. But the official naming of the commemorative highway on 243, 32, 14-3 from Fort Dufferin to Pearson at the Saskatchewan border. And they had a sign there, and it was officially inaugurated, first of all, in Clearwater. And dignitaries, Bonnie Mitchelson, Jack Penner, Bob Rose, came there. And at that time as well, the Manitoba map, I have one here, if you open it up, that little symbol is on the Manitoba map. It shows you where the trail is. And so I think it's still, I haven't got a new map this year or the last few years, but the ones I have show that particular, and so that if you want to travel somewhere where that has been, that's where you go. The sign, though, that they created, and I have pictures of it, was far too fancy. It had greens and blues, and it was an artist's work. But to create that on the highway was far too expensive. Plus, the speeding cars would just see a blur of fancy color. And so they wouldn't know it was a painting from France or what it was. And so they had to make a very simplified sign that would be easy to see from a distance, and red was chosen, obviously the red surge color, to give that indication. The next accomplishment was pamphlets and ways of sharing information. They found out that there were 44 sites along the trail that people could visit. And then a large map, Felix made these maps, and then they made pamphlets to go with it, and it had itemized all the tourist things along the trail. And then he made an 88-foot map with all of those on. And it was worth, apparently, upwards of, well, thousands of dollars, this map. And it was, he'd bring that to the meeting and string it up, and everybody was studying where Uncle Herb's farm and all these different things, and they were seeing where they were along the trail. And later on, that map was put into his attic, I suppose. And somehow, to make a long story short, Winkler Mall decided they wanted to put it up because they're on the trail. And so they bought it from him, and that, I think it's still there. I haven't been to Winkler for a wee while. But it's now, I had kind of negotiated a little bit. Felix didn't want to give it up, and they didn't want to pay, and I kind of fussed around a little bit. And I could always get my mom to do a few things, so I found out ways of finagling. So I was able to push a little bit, and it is hanging there today. And so if you go to the Winkler Mall, you could see the full map. I have copies here of the maps, and you can look at them later. Education became a very big part of the RCMP's, or the Boundary Commission's job, and they wanted to make sure that the kids knew something about this. Because it's one thing for you and I to talk about this till the cows come home, but one day they will come home and we won't be here to tell the story. So unless the kids know and think it's important, the RCMP group felt that there was no way that it was going to continue if we didn't share it with them. History books, and I have some of them here, and I taught it for 16 years, have a 5 or 6 line paragraph. And it's very simple, and the RCMP had a tough time, and we're happy to have them today, basically. So it really didn't raise their interest. Interest was raised about things that happened in London and Vancouver and Quebec. Well, that's lovely, but that's not here. And so kids, I believed, and the group believed at that time, needed to have notice of something happening in Manitoba, in the prairies, in the rural area, so that they could feel that it was good enough to be here. Their future wouldn't even be here to them. They would feel that sooner or later they'd just shake this prairie dust and be out of here. I felt at times that their enthusiasm for getting away from the rural area was more than anything else. And we wanted them to feel while they were here that it was okay to be here and that something indeed had happened here. So that's one reason why we wanted schools to start talking about not just, say, the RCMP history, but their local history. Snowflakes should know about how their community started. And I'm just talking about towns that we had around there. And so in each of our communities, no matter where we are, the kids need to know about the people who began the area here, where we are now. And so they feel that it belongs to them and there's some reason and some enthusiasm. Then the group decided they would do publications, and so there was some printings that they did, and I have copies of those. I told you about the 120-foot map and the 170 points, and it's in Winkler today. The major goal of the trail people as well was that the trail would be used today. And so for the 125th birthday and prior to that, many trail rides were organized. There was the 1990 wagon train that went 100 miles from Crystal City to Souris River. There was the 1991 wagon train that ran 200 miles from the Red River to the Souris River and continued 100 miles the next year into Estevan, Saskatchewan. Then in 93 it continued from there along the Badlands, along the Wood Mountains in 94, and finally to reach Fort Macleod. So the people of today were recreating in small portions the rides that they had done. I was very pleased and proud that my own children were old enough to take part in that wagon train. And a book was written, and one of them was called Drawing the Line. And it has in it the diary of Colonel French and a diary of the person riding in the train today. And they compare what happened to them, say, at Morden, or what happened to them when they crossed a certain creek. And if you had the two diaries side by side, the horrendous situations occurred again. Horses falling, this and this and this and this. So that book, I don't know where you would get a copy. I have one. The author, unfortunately, has passed away. He worked tirelessly. He sold his home. He sold his business. He gave his lifeblood for that book. And the happiest day for me was when he brought to my classroom a copy of the book and it was finally completed. I helped him proofread it. John and I both helped. And I said, caused his heart attacks. He just gave everything he had to completing that story. He was so committed to people knowing, yes, the old story, but the new story, and so on. Now I'm just above my hour, and I've done. As a classroom teacher, you have certain things you want to cover, and so I have not. I'm going to pat myself on the back just a touch. I've done everything I wanted to do at this point, and now your most precious words, in closing.
No.
Now, in closing, I want to encourage all of you who are armchair historians to be like those who work to bring the RCMP history alive of southern Manitoba. Be of good cheer and share the record and the stories that you know of before they are forgotten. There are few new stories to tell, but there are. Even this week, in the Free Press, you've all heard of the Viking establishments that were discovered. If you saw the paper read, last week, an archaeologist armed with a satellite discovered a second Viking village from space. And I'm not going to read any more of it, but what they did from space, there was some machine that could see where human inhabitants have been. And they read that from space, and now they have located a second Viking settlement. Now, these stories and these things are exciting, and to show kids that, or all of us, that it's not just the old stories, that's a new story to be written. And so, as fellow history lovers, we've got to honor the past, and we know it's an uphill battle. There are many forces at play. I've tried to reflect a rearview mirror on what one group tried to do to bring a part of Manitoba alive and make them realize from their children and their children's children that something happened here. A great number of movies and TV have been done today, and encyclopedias, the Manitoba Encyclopedia, the Canadian Encyclopedia, are highlighting the stories of ordinary people. Yes, MacDonald was great. Yes, Louis Riel started us out, but each of our grandparents and each of the people that we all know did some back-breaking things as well. And we would not be sitting in our comfortable little chairs waiting for coffee if they did not do those things. We have to make it a priority for tourists and consumers and locals to enjoy the things of the past. And I know in the city there's lots going, but in the rural areas it's tough for them to keep going. heritage and honors what has gone on is something we need to do with enthusiasm. For if you do not do this, who will do this? When I moved to Crystal City, I knew nothing of the history there. And so I started to find, as I talked about things about the RCMP, I started to imagine, and you could too, the buffalo dust on the prairie, the monsters pawing the ground, and the tormenting flies. I could see the native hunters studying the ground to see where the game had gone, seeking his own survival. I further viewed in my imagination a boundary creator as he wiped the sweat from his brow, and the new recruit of the RCMP who made way for the pioneer, our ancestor, as they found the best place for their well. Standing quietly in the prairie, you could see them all. Their struggle to survive is in us, and knowing this, we must realize and proclaim that we are linked by our desire for a good life and honor the past and our own future. We must believe that something happened here. Something in the way of progress, something to be told about and experienced and honored and gained from. We must treasure the freedom, the space, the land, and the work that our parents and grandparents to make the best of it, so that we would inherit and could hand on the benefits of Canada we know and love today. Then as now, Canada is not a perfect place, but one that we have the freedom to make it perfect. Collectively, we can do something for heritage, person by person, situation by situation, and so that majesty rises again, and those old things are but new. In the work of heritage, there are always projects on the drawing board and never enough money. But you have one thing that costs little: volunteerism. And of course, your group knows all about that. There are people placed that will give their time and effort for small things to become big. Children need to learn and understand that these people who faced an uncertain future came out and turned out okay. And in their lives today, they see a dim and burden-laden future. They can roll up their sleeves and cooperate with each other, just like our grandparents did. And like one of my wonderful students said at 10 years old, "Mr. Hamilton, I never knew I walked on history every day." Now, when a kid gets it, then you've hit the mark. That was the one time I wasn't good at any shooting or basketball or anything, but you hit the court that day. Learning about history can help young people interpret life's very message. They can learn to take part in democracy and see that people, individuals like ourselves, can make a difference in this life. They will see that things can change, started or improved, and according to the will of the people in what seems a difficult and horrible world. We are humble Canadians, our grandmothers made sure of that, and often do not take credit for the accomplishments, and our work and heritage is no different. Today is one day, today is 1 hour that we need to look at our accomplishments or what needs to be done. We must remember as we go that history and appreciation of it, we are sometimes like a nowhere man. And let me finish by some words from the most famous people I know, the Beatles. He's a real nowhere man, sitting there in his nowhere land, making nowhere plans for nobody. Doesn't have a point of view, knows not where he's going to. Isn't he a bit like you and me? Nowhere man, please listen. You don't know what you're missing. Nowhere man, the world is in your command. He's as blind as he can be, sees just what he wants to see. Nowhere man, can you see me at all? Nowhere man, don't worry. Take time, don't hurry. Leave it all till somebody else lends you a hand. Indeed, we can do it if we lend a hand. For if we don't do it, who will? We are far from nowhere. We are from a vibrant, happening situation, and we have a story to tell. Something did happen here, and the fact is getting out. It is being heard and understood and valued. Give yourself some credit and move on to even greater heights in heritage in this part of the world as has been done before. Let our common desire and our common share of history stretch unrenewed. The framework to begin will benefit everyone. To mark, promote, and be proud of the place we call and most importantly, our children will call home. Home is a big deal, and others will come and see it for themselves. Good luck to us all in keeping heritage alive in Manitoba. And thanks for letting me enjoy it again.
Were there any questions? Did anyone have a question?
Yes, sir.
Did you take part in the Ride West?
I rode, well, I was so busy taking pictures that day. My children did. And in fact, Bragg, just to touch, the picture on the front cover is taken just out of Clearwater. And my children are in that wagon. Now, you don't know that, but I know that. And their little faces are showing out the front there. But I did not, no, I did not. I was just so busy doing all the things that I did not ride on it. I should have, but I was busy keeping track of it all.
It was the ceremony at Fort Suffren.
Yes, I was there.
Had been quite the one with shield cops.
Yes, yes, I was there.
Out and so on.
And then she fell off the horse that time.
Yeah.
Yes. Bless her heart. She was dressed in all the finery, and no, it was a good deal.
They really knew how to throw a party that day.
They did. Now, before I let you get up, my wife's going to say, I told her she'll be doing like this.
No.
And I just wanted to quickly highlight, so you can glance at some of this and know what all of this collection is. And yes, dear, I do have to take this all home and put it somewhere. These are the paintings I was discussing, and you can look at those, of course, Manitoba's map. This is the group of students that, when I did a kit of information that turned into, and I'll show you over there in a minute, to an RCMP booklet with the history of the RCMP, just as I have told you. And this is the last class that were involved in that. 3 classes, 3 years studied that and did a pilot project with the RCMP for the 125th birthday. And Bruce was there the day we unveiled it. And I don't know if we put a kit in the library, but then later the RCMP put this box together, had a video with some of the stories that I was telling you, and lesson plans for the teachers, 8 lesson plans to show all the things I've told you, plus the treaties of the RCMP, the time of the Yukon, and it was all contained, I've got it somewhere else now, but all contained in here, and it was put in every RCMP detachment and every school in Manitoba. And my class were the ones who we proofread, and they came and worked with us on it, and they used material that I have to create this. The buffalo there is the actual, and it's not plaster of Paris or anything, it's an actual buffalo skull. I told you about the rug, the Hudson Bay flag, the blanket, of course. The little bit of family history, that log is out of the 1832 house my great-grandparents built. I got that out of the woods. They're still living in the house, and they made a picture window. And they threw the pieces of the logs that were in the house in the bush. And when we went there, I sawed it off to get there, and half of it was eaten by bugs by that time. But this is this thick already, so that's how thick the logs were in the house itself. My great-great-grandfather, apparently, there was no stairs from the upstairs. He used to